Hey guys, today I'm going to show you how to build a small landing page, and I'm going to show you how to build a collapsible sidebar using just HTML, CSS, and a little bit of JavaScript. So I hope you learned something and enjoy the video. I'm going to do this a little bit differently today. I'm going to try to do this in one take, so I'm going to leave in all my mistakes, mainly so you can see what the debugging process is like if I mess something up. So we'll see how it goes. Let's start by making our files. So we're going to make an index.html file, styles.css, and we're going to need a little bit of JavaScript at the end, so let's call it script.js. Okay. So for our index.html, we're going to use Emmet to lay out our file. We'll give it a title of menu. We're going to link to our styles.css, and we're going to open this with live server. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is get our nice background, and I really like this website, Pexels. You may have heard of it. They have really good high quality stock photos, and they're free to use. So let's search space. We'll use this one, and when you download, the original is almost always too big and it will make your loading time slow. I usually go with large. So you can download that, and I'm just going to grab it from my downloads folder, and oops, let's drag that in here. Oh, and that didn't work very well. Give me one sec. Let's drag that in here, and we're going to rename this BG, and while we're at it, we'll put it in an images folder. There we go. So in our index.html, we're going to include a main tag, and main is pretty much where you put all of the main stuff in your app. Can be used pretty widely, so we're going to use it here. And what we're going to do is we're going to target that main and use this property called background image. And background image takes a URL, which you can just use as a relative path, and we're going to put in the relative path to our image, which is images/bg.jpg. You'll notice when I save, nothing actually pops up here. That's because this actually puts the background image to the element that you specify, but there's no background right now because main has no content, so it has no height. So we're going to add a height to it. We're going to do height 100 VH. And there it is. So you'll notice that there's actually some margin around that, and that's because body has some built-in margin. So we're going to get rid of that. Let's go body margin 0. There we go. You'll notice, it's a nice picture, but it actually doesn't look centered and doesn't look that great. I'd say 99% of the time when you use background image, you're going to want to throw in these two properties. First is background position, center, does exactly like it sounds, and then you want background size and cover. So this is going to center your image, and it's also going to make it responsive too. So you see when I shrink or go to different widths, it still stays in the center and it doesn't get, the ratio is still nice. Also, this happens sometimes. I apologize. Give me 2 seconds. Okay. All right, so now we have our background image. The next step is we're going to want this hamburger menu popping up here. So I like using either material icons or bootstrap icons. They have free SVGs to use, and they're honestly great. I use them all the time. So let's search menu in here, and we're going to grab this one. So you can download it, pops up here. This is how I usually do it. There's probably a better way. I just dragged it in, copy the SVG. We're going to throw that in our main, and then I delete the file after. Save that. And we don't actually see it yet. I think it actually is right here, but SVG, they use this. Actually, we're going to give it an ID, sorry. Let's give it an ID, call it hamburger. This is a hamburger menu. And now we can actually target it. And SVGs have this property called fill, which is basically the color of them, and we're going to give it a fill of white. And there it is. So it's a little small, and you can actually see in the HTML that it has a height and width of 24 pixels. So we're going to increase that. Let's go height 38 pixels, width 38 pixels. Oops, missed the X. And there we go. So it's a little too high in the corner of our screen, so let's give it some margin. There we go. So it's positioned a little bit better now. So now that we have our background and our hamburger menu, we're going to start working on the sidebar. And the sidebar is what's going to pop out here. So in our HTML, under the SVG, we're going to add a div with an ID of sidebar. So let's call it sidebar. And within this div, we're going to include some anchor tags because they're going to have links to home, about, and contact. So each of these anchor tags is going to have a class of sidebar item, and we'll give it 3. There we go. And within each of these, we're actually going to have, if you remember, we had like an SVG that was like a house next to home. So we're going to have an SVG, and then we're going to have a div with a word. So let's just do the div right now. Div is home. This next one will be about, and then we'll do contact. Okay, and you can actually see them up here, right here. Very faintly, but we're going to work on that. So first, let's work on the sidebar ID. So we're going to start by giving it a width of 250 pixels. This is what's going to be the width when it pops all the way out. And we're going to give it a height of 100 VH, so it's going to take up the height of our screen. And we're going to give it a background color that's a little bit off-white. So RGB 247, 247, 247. There we go. So you can see that this is not looking great, and we have a little bit of a scrolling action going right here, and that's because we told this to take up 100 VH, so it's taking the size from the top of our screen to the bottom, but there is still the SVG above it, so it's positioned below this SVG and still has this whole height. So now we're getting this scroll action, and obviously we don't want that. So the way we fix that is by using the position fixed property. And position fixed basically tells us that we can put this element anywhere we want on the screen, and no matter where we are, it's going to still appear in that same spot. And we always want it to be in the top left. So let's do position fixed. We give it top 0 and left 0, and this is basically how you say we want it top left, top 0, left 0. We're also going to give it a z index of 2. And z indexes say that they tell you when you have elements that are positioned on top of each other, the ones with the higher z index will appear on top. So right now this has a z index of 2, and the hamburger menu has no z index, so the sidebar will be positioned on top. And this will come into play more later as well. So let's work on those sidebar items now. It's home, about, and contact. Let's target sidebar item. Now, with all links, you're always going to get these default properties of underlined, and they're slightly colored, so let's get rid of that. Text decoration, none, color, black. Okay. And I don't love this font, so I'm going to show you a very easy way to add a better looking font. We're going to use Google Fonts. And I really like Montserrat. I use it a lot. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but whatever. So let's use this style, and all you do is go to embed. You can import it, and you copy this import statement and put it at the top of your CSS. And now we want to use it, we can just use this property, font family Montserrat, and we're actually going to target our entire HTML. So this HTML tag here, which is everything. So now everything, no matter when we use it, is going to use this font family. You can see now it already looks a little bit better. Let's see, so we need to add the SVGs here. So we want like the house in front of home. So let's go back here and get these SVGs. Let's look up home. This one looks good. Download that. And we're going to do the same process as before. Let's drag that in there, copy it, put it in our HTML. For about, we'll just use a person. Let's see. Sorry if you hear that construction outside. Alright, select person, download that, drag it in here, copy. And then for a contact, let's look up phone. Click that, download the SVG, same process. And place that there. And then also, let's just clean up a little bit. Let's get rid of these. Okay, so we have what we need to here, but now we need to position it better. So we're going to go back to our CSS, and in our sidebar item, we're going to add display flex. So for each one of these is its own sidebar item, and display flex is going to put them next to each other. We're also going to add in just some padding. They need some room to breathe a little bit, so let's do 1 EM all the way around. And then you'll also see that home is actually not centered. All the words are starting at the top here, so let's add in align items, and this is a flex property, center. There, we center those. And then let's also add in cursor pointer, so when we hover over them, we get this little pointer effect. So next we need to add in a little bit of padding around the words too. They're just too close to the SVGs right now. So let's add in sidebar item div, and this is targeting any div that's a direct child of the class's sidebar. So if we look back in our HTML, we have these anchor tags with the class's sidebar and direct child div. So we're targeting those words. And let's give it a padding of 0, 1 EM. And when you write it shorthand like this, the first number is the top and bottom padding, and the second number is the left and right. So there we go. These words have some padding now. And we also wanted to add a nice hover effect when you hover over them to tell you which item you're about to click. So let's, for our sidebar item, let's add in a hover effect. So sidebar item, :hover, and let's change the background color, can't type today, to RGB 212, 212, 212. Good. So now when you hover over them, we get this nice hover effect. So the last thing we're going to do with the HTML and CSS is we're actually going to add in an overlay. And what I mean by that is generally when you have a sidebar come out, the rest of the screen turns a little bit gray, just to let you know that this is what's active, and anything else over here is not clickable at the moment. So to do that, we're going to go back to our HTML, and ahead of this sidebar div, we're just going to add in one more div with an ID of overlay. Okay, and then down here we're going to target it. Now we want this overlay to pretty much take up the entire width and height of the screen, but we want it to be behind this sidebar. So that's where the Z index is going to come into play. So let's give it a width of 100 VW, which stands for view width, I think. Basically makes it take up the entire width of the screen. Height of 100 VH. We're going to give it a background color of RGBA. So RGBA means that it gives you the fourth argument of opacity. So we're giving it the color of black with an opacity of 4, which basically makes it gray. So you can see here when I save, and again we're getting the same issue as before where the SVG is actually right behind here and this is below the SVG. So we're getting the scrolling effect, which we don't want. So we're going to fix it in the same way. So position fixed, top 0, left 0, and then we're going to give this a Z index of 1 because we want it to be behind this sidebar, which has a Z index of 2. Okay, and there we go. So when the sidebar comes out, this is what we want to display. So this is pretty much it for the index HTML and CSS right now. So now we're actually going to work on the JavaScript a little bit. So the JavaScript is going to allow this to have some functionality. So it's going to allow our sidebar to go in and out. And I want you to think about what's actually happening. So what's going to actually happen is all we're going to do is change the width of this sidebar. So we're going to start it at 0 pixels. And it's going to move out to 250 pixels, and that will give it the illusion that it's coming out. And sorry, one last thing I realized before we move on to the JavaScript is that right now you see when I give this the sidebar a width of 0px, there's actually you can still see very faintly the text that was in there, and then they also still have the hover effect. And that's because right now, if this has a width of 0px, but there's content inside it, there's overflow going on. So the way you account for that is all you do is you give this sidebar the property overflow hidden. And overflow has the default value, I think, of visible. So by making it hidden, we're saying that if the content does not fit in here based on sidebar's width, just hide it. So now this looks better. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the JavaScript, and we're going to include a script tag in our HTML. I like putting it at the bottom. So source equals our script.js. And I'm not going to give this, or I'm not going to make this video a whole JavaScript tutorial, but I will go over some of the basics that we're using. So what we want to do first is we want to select the items in our HTML and make them into variables so we can manipulate them. So the first thing we're going to select is our Hamburger Menu, which has an ID of hamburger. So we'll do const hamburger equals, and with JavaScript you can get it by using document.getElementById, and then you just put in its ID, which is hamburger. And we're going to do the same thing and also select the sidebar and the overlay because we want to change both the sidebar and the overlay. So a helpful tip if you're on Mac is to you can highlight a word and hit Command D and it selects the next instant, and you can type at the same time. So let's give this one sidebar, and for here, overlay. Alright, so now we have variables that are representing these IDs. We're also going to make a state variable called menu open, which is just going to keep track of whether or not our menu is open. and since it's starting close, we want to set it to false. And the reason we're using let here and const up here is because when you're making a variable, if you know its value is going to change, like menu open is going to change from false to true, you have to initialize it with let. So now we're going to make two functions that are going to tell our document what to do when we open and close the menu. So the first one, let's do function open menu. The first thing we're going to do is change this variable and tell us that the menu is now open, so menu open equals true. And now we're going to use these variables. So the first thing we're going to do is add a style to this overlay. So the way you add CSS using JavaScript is you write overlay.style.display. And before I finish this, I realized actually that our overlay is still displaying right now. This is what we want it to be eventually, but we actually want it to start out with a display of none. So now when we target it, when we open the menu, we change that style, so style.display, this is the CSS property we want to change, and what do we want to change it to? We want to change it to block, and block is just the default value for display. Now for sidebar, we're going to do something similar. We're going to do style.width, because that's the property we want to change, and we're changing it to 250 px. Okay, and now for close menu, it's kind of just going to be the opposite. So let's say close menu, menu open is going to be false. We're going to display none for the overlay. The width is going to go back to 0. Okay, so now we have these two functions. So how do we make these run when we click this hamburger menu? The way we do that with JavaScript is to add an event listener. So we're going to target hamburger. We're going to do .add event listener, and the first argument is what you're listening for. So we're going to listen for a click on here. The second argument is a function that will run when you click it. So we're going to run this function. We're going to say if menu open, and this is a shorthand way of testing if menu open is false with this exclamation point. We're going to open the menu. We're just going to run this function that we wrote. And then for overlay, oh sorry, no, we don't want overlay. So again for hamburger, oh I apologize. So when we click this hamburger, it's going to open, and in order to close the hamburger menu, this hamburger is going to be hidden by the menu. So we want it so when we click on any other piece, meaning the overlay, it's going to close. So we actually do want to target the overlay here. And you'll see what I mean in a minute. So now we're saying if the menu is already open, so we have our menu open and the overlay here, when we click on the overlay, we want to close the menu. And this should actually do the trick right here. So now you see when we click the hamburger menu, we get the sidebar opening and we get the overlay displaying. And now when we click the overlay, it should close it. So obviously it's not very fluid right now. And one thing I want to do actually on the hamburger menu, I just want to add in a cursor pointer here. There we go. So it's functioning right now, but it's not the most fluid. So the way we can make this a little more fluid is with a CSS transition, and all a CSS transition does is it says when a CSS property is added or taken away, we're going to make that transition between those two properties smooth. So for sidebar, we want this width to come out in a smooth manner and also close in a smooth manner. So we're going to add this transition property, and the first thing that you put into transition is the property that's going to be changing, so width, and the second is the amount of time you want the transition to take. So the more time we put in here, the longer it will take for the menu to open and close. So we'll do 0.5 seconds. And the last thing you put in is this function that determines, how you want the transition to go. Sorry, that's not a great explanation, but linear would be if you just want it to be coming out in the same amount of time as it's closing, or you can have it start a little faster and end a little slower. Don't worry too much about this last thing. It's not really that necessary. So now that we've added this transition, it's a lot smoother now and looks way better. But now that there's this transition, you can see that when it closes, and I guess when it just opens, we have a little weird functionality going on right now. So we're going to add in two properties to help with that functionality. The first is in Sidebar, we're going to add this property called whitespace no wrap. And this is actually going to make sure that the words, and I guess it doesn't really come into play that much here, but if there were multiple words here and it closed, it would actually wrap it onto a second line, and that wouldn't be great. But so we do want to add in no wrap, even though we only have one word here. But the other thing is that the SVGs, when there's not enough space, they're disappearing, and we don't really want that to disappear. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to target those SVGs. So we're going to say dot sidebar item SVG. So this means that any SVG that's a descendant of sidebar item, and we're going to give this property called flex shrink, and we have access to this property because we have I think sidebar item is flex here, so we have access to this flex shrink property. And flex shrink 0 is just going to mean that it's not going to disappear, and the only thing that will make it disappear is this overflow hidden. So there you go, much smoother. So now we have our nice little landing page, and we have this functional sidebar. So that's it for today. If this video helped you guys, be sure to like and subscribe. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and I'll see you next week.